Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of On Attachment. In today's episode, I want to talk about quite a sensitive topic, but one that is really close to my heart and is a guiding principle underpinning a lot of how I approach this work, which is the demonization of avoidant attachment. Now, if you've been around here for a while and you're familiar with my philosophy and my approach when it comes to attachment, you'd know that I am big on extending compassion and curiosity to everyone, irrespective of their attachment style. And I'm very deliberate about how I talk about avoidant attachment and anxious attachment in terms of not villainizing anyone and really encouraging a view of people's behavior and struggles as protective, understanding that all of our attachment strategies are ultimately designed in one way or another to facilitate us creating safety for ourselves, creating a sense of belonging. As easy as it is when you're on the receiving end of someone's behavior that you don't like, that triggers something in you, to villainize them and to, project ill intent onto them. That's so rarely, I would say almost never, the case that people set out with the intention to cause harm. And of course, that compassion must be accompanied by discernment and boundaries and self-advocacy, knowing our own limits and being very clear around our standards for what we will and won't tolerate, and knowing what behaviors, what qualities, what traits allow us to thrive in a relationship. So it's not about over-indexing on compassion in the sense of condoning any and all behavior because we can understand where it arises from. But equally, I think the unfortunate trend in a lot of online spaces is for anxiously attached people who have been hurt by previous relationships with avoidant partners to take those experiences and to take that unhealed hurt and to make these sweeping generalizations around all avoidant people are selfish, toxic, narcissistic, a waste of space. Those are just a small handful of the types of comments that I have seen flying around. And this episode is actually prompted by some events this week on my own Instagram account. I shared a post which I honestly thought was totally uncontroversial. I was very surprised to see it going viral and for the comment section to be blowing up. But it was a post about what avoidant people look for in a partner. And the list was along the lines of independence, so someone who has other things going on in their life, who has hobbies and friendships and a well-developed sense of self, someone who is emotionally regulated and stable, so not someone who's highly reactive and emotionally volatile, someone with healthy boundaries, someone who's able to bring fun and lightness to the relationship so that it doesn't feel really emotionally dense and heavy all the time. And as I said, I didn't think that this list was controversial in the slightest, but it became very quickly apparent from people's response to this post that it was activating something, it was triggering something in a lot of people, a lot of anxiously attached people. And a lot of people seemed to be receiving that and responding to it as if it were saying, you, anxious person, need to embody all of these traits in order to adapt to the preferences of someone with avoidant attachment, and or it's your fault that the relationship between you and whoever your avoidant ex is didn't work out because you weren't enough of these things. That's kind of the most generous interpretation I can come up with for the very fiery responses that were in the comments section. But it has had me reflecting these past couple of days and feeling like there's a broader conversation to be had around the demonization of avoidant attachment. Not only because I do feel really strongly about promoting a more compassionate view of all attachment patterns as an adaptation, and really recognizing that until we extend that compassion towards others, we will not have that compassionate view of ourselves. But also, sort of more practically speaking, for anxiously attached people who are the overwhelming majority of my audience and clients and students, I can tell you from having worked with thousands and thousands of people on healing anxious attachment that for so long as you are harboring that level of anger and bitterness and these sweeping views of avoidant people as being the problem in your relationships, that is actually going to keep you from your own growth, because that blame-based shame-based mindset around attachment, around relationships, one that tries to isolate who the villain and the victim are and wants to lay blame on someone else and say they're the problem and they're a waste of space and they need to just go to therapy and be on their own and all they ever do is cause pain. All these really highly inflammatory sweeping generalizations. I promise you that that is not going to be the place from which you will grow into a more secure attachment. Shaming other people is not how you get to a secure attachment. Stewing in anger is not how you get to a secure attachment. There's a lack of both self-compassion, compassion for other, and self-responsibility and honesty in the way that we're looking at our own relationship patterns. And until we look at those things with honesty, that's going to impede our ability to meaningfully shift and grow. So I wanted to share some thoughts about that. It's probably going to be slightly different in tone to my regular episodes in that it's not so much a me teaching as it is me reflecting and discussing and sharing some thoughts on the demonization of avoidant attachment. But it does feel like an important conversation. And I will say from this recent experience on Instagram, the silver lining, it's always disheartening to feel like you're doing work to try and break down some of these unhelpful generalizations or stereotypes. And so it's a little disheartening to see so much of that still alive and well in the comments section on a viral post. But what it did remind me of is how fortunate I am and how grateful I am that for the most part, my community, my listeners here, people on Instagram that are familiar with my work, that's not the tone. And I could really tell in the comment section of this post, the people who'd been kind of in my universe for a little while, the people who'd done my programs, stuff like that, it was really apparent because of the self-awareness and the nuance and the thoughtfulness. So that was at least really affirming for me. And I was really grateful to be reminded of the fact that that's not the norm. And as is always the case, when something goes viral, it gets pushed to a lot of people who might not usually engage with your content or might not know your work. So the silver lining of having to be on the receiving end of a lot of people's projections and judgments and misunderstandings of my own intention in creating that content was being grateful that that isn't the norm and that my community in large part is really curious and compassionate and thoughtful and nuanced in the way that they engage with my work and this body of work more broadly. So a quick word of thanks to all of you who are regular listeners and who do put in the effort to take on that compassionate and nuanced view, because in many ways the sugar hit junk food version where we just shoot from the hip and let our wounded part run wild, in many ways that's easier. So I suppose I want to talk about why I think this happens. Why do we demonize avoidant attachment? And I think the simple answer is that generally people with insecure attachment patterns struggle with very black and white thinking. They tend to be quite oppositional, dualistic, this sense of right or wrong, blame. I've spoken about this many times before on the podcast. There's this sense of I need to find who the bad guy is, and I'm hoping that it isn't me. And particularly for anxiously attached people whose pattern in relationship is to strive and to work really hard all the time and to overfunction and over everything and desperately try and keep the relationship intact and caretake and all of those things. The idea that you could be the problem or the villain or the bad guy feels so impossible given how hard you've tried and how earnestly you've tried, and you have. And so when you're in this mindset of one of us has to be the problem, and I've been trying so hard, so surely it can't be me, it's much more palatable that it would be them. And I've done an episode in the past, which was one of my top episodes ever, called The 3 Stages of Healing Anxious Attachment. And it's really about these mindset shifts that people undergo, and that a lot of people start in a mindset of assuming they are the problem. And that low self-worth plays low self-esteem. I have to change myself. There's something wrong with me. I need to be more or less or different or better in order to get someone to love me. And then a lot of people go from that starting point of really low self-esteem. Maybe they go through a breakup. or they just come across this work and they feel really validated by it. And they swing to another extreme, which is that of, wait, I'm not the problem, you're the problem. The avoidant person's the problem. My ex is the problem. They're emotionally unavailable and toxic and narcissistic and whatever other labels I can reach for that make me feel really validated in my pain and my hurt. And if I can put those labels on you and feel like my hurt is justified and that anyone would have been hurt in my position, then I start to feel a little less powerless. But the trouble is that pendulum swing to the other extreme of, wait, no, you're the problem, it misses the full picture. And it might feel temporarily good, but it can keep us really stuck, and it generally does keep us really stuck. And I wasn't brave enough to respond to the comments on this Instagram post saying as much, but I could tell the people who'd done their work and the people who were stuck in their anxious attachment and in more extreme expressions of that, because the people who are holding on to a lot of that very kind of blunt, lacking in nuance, vitriolic judgments towards avoidant people at large, those are not people who are very close to becoming secure, in my experience and in my observation, again, having a decent sample size of having worked with thousands of people on this. Which brings me to what is a healing mindset and what does bode really well for you if you are doing this work and you are wanting to become more secure, is what I called in that episode a stage 3 mindset. And it's this idea that neither of us individually were the problem or were to blame. The unique combination of our wounds and our self-protective strategies and our limitations and our maybe conflicting needs, all of that went into a melting pot. And the sum total of it was a level of dysfunction or stuckness that we lacked the tools to overcome. And that's not juicy, right? There's no like big flashy headlines in that, but it's honest. And it takes in the full picture and the full reality of what happened. And it's only in looking at that honestly that we can take some of the heat out, for starters. But we can also then start to figure out, okay, what was my contribution to whatever unhealthy patterns existed there? What did I get out of it? Because as much as we might not want to admit it, there's at least a part of us that got something out of all of that. And, you know, what need was I trying to meet, and how could I do things differently next time? When we're just in that kind of blame-based mindset of anger and projection, there's actually nothing very fertile there in terms of our own growth. There's no space for self-reflection. There's no space for nuance or honesty. And as such, there's nothing for us to really learn from there, because we're not actually engaging with reality. So recognizing that being in that kind of mindset, that oppositional, dualistic, right or wrong, good or bad, who's to blame, who's the bad one, who's the problem, that mindset is going to keep you stuck. And I really, really encourage you, if you notice yourself going there, and it's nothing to be ashamed of, because I think we're all trained into that mindset societally, but it's not going to support you if you are wanting to go from insecure attachment to a more secure way of being in relationships. That mindset is not something that you want to take with you on the journey. Let's put it that way. I want to talk now a little about avoidant attachment more specifically, and just, I suppose, almost a reminder to people who, again, maybe you notice yourself judging avoidant attachment as bad or wrong or less than, the worst attachment style, the hardest attachment style to be in relationship with. And I think a lot of anxious people can get a bit judgy around it and a bit righteous. And that's something I hear a lot is, well, at least I'm trying, or at least we want to be in relationships. You just blah, 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 blah. And I think it's easy to get a bit high and mighty, right? And to assume that like your way is better. And well, at least I'm selfless. At least I'm caring. And I think it's important for us all to recognize that our attachment patterns, no matter how they manifest, are about our own needs first and foremost, getting our own relational needs met. And it just so happens that the anxious person derives safety from the other person, whereas the avoidant person derives safety from keeping a bit of a safe distance, keeping a buffer. And so that's not to say that avoidant people don't want relationships or don't need connection and love. They do. But they have a history of feeling really unsafe when up close against that, when confronted with that level of intimacy and vulnerability, such that their instinct is to pull back. And I think that reminding ourselves, particularly of the typical origin story of avoidant attachment, can be a bit of a pathway to connection. So for anyone who isn't familiar, most avoidant attachment originates in an early family environment where children, babies, were denied their emotional needs. So they might have had parents who were often avoidant themselves and who were so emotionally stunted or underdeveloped or unavailable that the child's bids for connection, their attempts at getting those attachment needs met, their proximity-seeking behaviours, were shunned, ignored, dismissed, even shamed or ridiculed. So that very typical kind of old school parenting of telling kids to stop crying, this sense that children are meant to be like emotionally strong and independent and self-sufficient. And so a child in this environment, it's almost like the heartbreak and the grief and the sorrow of having your attempts at emotional connection denied or ignored or dismissed. A child in that environment adapts by learning very quickly that that's not the way to be close with my caregivers. That's not going to get me the safety, the approval, having my needs met. And as an infant, as a child, that is a survival need very directly and literally. So children who develop an avoidant attachment and are in those sorts of family systems learn that that's not how they're going to thrive in that system, by being highly emotionally in tune with themselves and others, that's not the language of that family. And so they channel their energy and their efforts into other ways of getting that connection and approval, which often amongst avoidant people is like through either activities and things that are less kind of intimate and vulnerable, or achievement. So being good, being successful, being competent, being capable. Those are a lot of the common traits of avoidant people, is that they focus on that, and they often are really good at all of that. As a result, they are successful, they are competent, they are capable. And as a side note, that's why it's so hard in relationships for people with avoidant attachment to feel like their partner's always disappointed in them, because for them, like a form of love and essential to the love relationship is, I want to feel successful to you. And if I feel like I'm always failing you, I'm always letting you down, I'm always disappointing you, that's very, very demoralizing for them and very triggering of that kind of deep wound around feeling inadequate, feeling not enough. So just bearing in mind, and I think when we go back to the origin story, and you can, if you have an avoidant partner or avoidant ex-partner, thinking of them as a child who longed for connection but had those needs denied, maybe that's a doorway to more compassion than you might otherwise have. You know, we all come by our attachment styles honestly. It's not like someone is a selfish, uncaring child and that's how they come to be emotionally undeveloped as an adult, right? These are just the cards that we were dealt. And of course, I know people are going to be listening and going, yeah, well, that's your responsibility to deal with it. And yeah, of course it is. And people are going to get there at different times and on different timelines. And I think we also have to recognize that for people with avoidant attachment, part of their operating system is to not look at that stuff, to not be particularly inquisitive about their emotional landscape. For some people, for some who are more fearful, avoidant, or disorganized, that might not be true. But for some, that is part of the blueprint, is we don't go there, or that doesn't feel safe. And so having compassion for the fact that people are going to come to this differently, or they may not at all. And that doesn't make them a terrible person. That doesn't make them deficient or inadequate or bad. Recognizing that there's good reason for why people do the things that they do, and coming back to this fundamental balance that we all need to be aiming for between compassion and a starting assumption of goodness and humanness, and trying to feel into someone's humanity. while also knowing ourselves and being self-responsible to maybe decide that another person's limitations are such that it's not a good idea for us to be in a relationship. That, their limits in terms of intimacy, vulnerability, commitment, communication, all of those things might mean that they're not a good match for me. And that's fine, but they don't have to be a bad person. I don't have to say like they're a waste of space. I don't have to reach for things that are villainizing and nasty so as to justify my decision to keep a distance from someone who maybe the nature of their self-protective patterns is such that they cause me harm and that it's not a good fit for me. That's okay, and we can reach that conclusion, and oftentimes we will need to do that in the name of taking good care of ourselves and being self-responsible for our own well-being. But you don't have to go to that next step of making someone bad or making them wrong in order to feel like you are justified or you are right to not want to be with them. And whenever I see that, which unfortunately is often, and certainly this latest event in the comment section of this post that's gone viral, that is just like a whole lot of unprocessed hurt coming out in the form of projection and blame and judgment. And I think my message for those people is I understand the hurt. I understand the pain. I've been there. I've been on the receiving end of behaviors that were baffling to me, that I really couldn't make sense of, that it was very easy for me to judge as just like, what is wrong with you? Who would do that? And yet that's not helpful. And the more that I went down that path of trying to make someone bad and trying to convince them of their badness so that they would change, all that did was drag me into it. And it certainly was not conducive to my growth. It was only when I stopped doing that I actually was able to start healing and start paying attention to what it was in me that got me into those dynamics and kept me there for as long as I was there. So your healing is not going to be found in the comment section of an Instagram post labeling avoidance as whatever you want to label them as. I promise you that. So I think I'll stop there. As much as I could keep going on my soapbox about this for a long time, because as you might have sensed, it's something that I feel really strongly about. Again, as I said in the introduction, not only because I think it's the right thing to do to try and get this message out, but also because just it won't work for all of those people who are anxious and want to shift their patterns and have somehow convinced themselves that the way to do that is to make all avoidant people the devil. It actually is keeping you stuck. So for all of those reasons, it's really important that we start looking at this differently and that we learn to hold multiple truths that might seem conflicting. Someone might have hurt me and that doesn't make them a bad person, and it certainly doesn't make all avoidant people bad. As a side note, I know I said I was going to wrap up and I will, but when people ask me in my programs, students of mine say, how do I pick out an avoidant person in early dating so I can avoid them and save myself the pain? My answer is always, I wouldn't focus on someone's attachment style. I would focus on getting very clear around what are your specific requirements or values or non-negotiables for a relationship, and how does this person stack up against those? So those might be communication or consistency, reliability, emotional safety, and be really clear around what you will and won't tolerate and what you need, and just see how someone measures against that. So don't be focusing on avoidant attachment as an umbrella, because that's a really, really big bucket of people, and there's so much individual variation in terms of someone's capacity, how much work they've done, their self-awareness, their willingness, and all of those factors and variables will influence whether or not someone might be a good fit for you. So look beyond the label of avoidant attachment and be a little more curious, be a little more open, rather than just trying to filter based on a very crude metric. So anyway, I will wrap up. I will leave it there. I hope that for those of you who are already onto all of this, I know that's a good chunk of you, and I'm so appreciative. As I said at the start, it is very affirming for me that most of the people in my kind of regular community of listeners and followers and students and stuff, that everyone gets it. And that's really nice, and I'm very grateful for that. But for anyone who's maybe coming around to the idea, or maybe not sure, or maybe has that instinct towards blame and attack and villainization and all of that stuff, I hope that this has given you something to reflect on and think about, and maybe enticing you towards a different approach that you could just try on for size. Because, the version of things where you swirl around in bitterness and resentment and blame is not going to get you any closer to where you ultimately want to be. I feel pretty confident in saying that. So I hope that it's been helpful. I'm grateful for all of you. Thanks so much for joining me, and I will see you again next week. Thanks, guys.